Sandra Bullock arrived at the grand charity gala, her understated elegance a stark contrast to the dazzling excess surrounding her. Across the room, two wealthy socialites whispered behind their champagne glasses, their laughter laced with mockery. They thought they had the power to decide who belonged, but what happened next would shatter their illusions and leave the entire ballroom speechless. Before we dive into the full story, let us know where you're watching from. And if you love gripping stories like this, make sure to subscribe, because tomorrow we have another incredible tale you won't want to miss. The Blackwood Club's grand archway rose before Sandra Bullock like a portal to a bygone era, its stone edges carved with intricate vines and weathered by decades of lavish affairs. She stepped through, her low heels tapping against the expanse of polished marble that gleamed beneath a galaxy of chandeliers, each one a cascade of crystals, refracting golden light into shimmering constellations across the vaulted ceiling. The air thrummed with the murmur of cultured voices, a tapestry of polite laughter, and the delicate clink of crystal glasses, while a string quartet tucked into a corner spun Vivaldi's notes into the evening's fabric. Every detail radiated extravagance, the tables draped in snowy linens, their place settings glittering with diamond-encrusted silverware. The waitstaff gliding silently with trays of champagne flutes and caviar-dotted blinis. The walls lined with oil portraits of stern-faced nobles, their gazes fixed as if appraising the night's elite assemblage. Sandra's midnight blue silk dress flowed around her like a gentle current, its understated elegance a quiet rebellion against the room's flamboyance. The fabric caught the light with a subtle sheen, devoid of sequins or garish adornments, no ostentatious train, no cascade of jewels at her throat or wrists. She wore simplicity like armor, her presence unannounced by bodyguards or a trailing entourage. She entered alone, her head high but her steps unhurried, blending into the shadows rather than demanding the spotlight. In a world where status was the coin of the realm, her lack of flash was a whisper amid a chorus of shouts, and it drew eyes, whether she intended it or not. Across the ballroom, near a bar of polished mahogany that gleamed like liquid amber, two women stood like arbiters of high society. Genevieve Harrow shimmered in a gown of silver sequins that hugged her frame, the light dancing across her like a mirrored lake under moonlight. Her green eyes, sharp as cut glass, swept the room with predatory precision, landing on Sandra with a faint curl of her lip. Beside her, Charlotte Lancaster radiated regal disdain, her emerald velvet dress clinging to her curves, diamonds at her ears and throat winking like tiny stars. She swirled her champagne, the bubbles catching the glow as she leaned closer to Genevieve, her voice a velvet murmur laced with venom. "Look at that dress," Genevieve said, her tone smug as she tilted her glass toward Sandra. Did she mistake this for a poetry slam at some dusty little cafe? Charlotte's laugh was a soft chime, her diamonds flashing as she tilted her head. "It's almost quaint, isn't it? She must think elegance means playing the humble card. Poor thing." Their words drifted just far enough to tickle the ears of nearby guests. A clique of impeccably tailored men and women who smirked or nodded in silent accord. It was a performance, a scalpel disguised as a whisper, designed to wound without drawing blood. They sought the room's approval, the tacit endorsement of their peers, and they got it. A ripple of amusement, a few arched brows, a collective tilt of heads. In their eyes, Sandra had been judged and dismissed, a stranger who didn't speak their language of excess. What they didn't know, what none of them could have dreamed, was that Sandra wasn't merely a guest drifting through their gilded orbit. She was the evening's unseen architect, the silent force whose generosity had birthed the event itself. Her donations had fueled the charity auction. Her quiet influence had drawn this glittering crowd. And the sharpest twist of all, she was the personal guest of Keanu Reeves, the man who'd woven this night together with his unassuming grace. Their error wasn't just a social stumble. It was a misjudgment that would dismantle their carefully curated thrones before the clock struck midnight. The ballroom pulsed with orchestrated life. Waiters wove through the throng, their black vests crisp as they offered delicate morsels, smoked salmon on rye, truffle-kissed mushrooms nestled in pastry shells. Conversations hummed around cultivated topics. The latest Matisse acquisition at Sotheby's, the shifting alliances in Washington's corridors. The hushed thrill of a financier's downfall murmured over dessert forks. Sandra moved toward the bar, her pace deliberate, her expression serene as she requested a glass of Pinot Noir. The bartender, a young man with a practiced smile, slid it across the counter, and she thanked him with a nod that carried genuine warmth. The whispers brushing her ears didn't shake her, or so she convinced herself as she lifted the glass, the wine's earthy notes curling against her tongue. But the night had claws, and they sank deeper as the hours unfurled. She reached for her drink again, the crystal cool against her palm, when Genevieve's voice sliced through the ambient chatter, soft yet unmistakable in its bite. Someone should have told her. This isn't a soup kitchen handout, it's a gala. Did she think modesty would impress us? Charlotte sighed with exaggerated pity, her diamonds glinting as she tossed her head. I do admire her pluck, though. Some people just don't see that wealth demands certain standards. The words settled over Sandra like a damp fog, chilling her skin despite the room's warmth. She wasn't green. She'd danced in these circles before, knew the currencies of power, influence, money, the right cut of a gown. But there was a venom in their laughter, a deliberate cruelty in how they dissected her, as if she were a curiosity on display. She stood close enough to catch the floral sting of Genevieve's perfume, the faint musk of Charlotte's wealth, yet they spoke as if she were a ghost. Her fingers tightened around her glass, the pressure a silent anchor as their mockery burrowed into her chest. Not pain, not yet, but a slow, simmering ember of defiance. She could have turned away, let their pettiness dissolve into the evening's hum. But something stirred, a flicker of resolve, a refusal to let their game dictate her worth. From the edge of her vision, she caught their choreography, the sidelong glances they cast, the subtle nods they drew from others like a conductor coaxing a symphony. It wasn't just scorn, it was a public erasure, a signal to the room that she was an interloper. And the crowd acquiesced, not with words, but with the weight of averted gazes, the silence of exclusion weaving tighter around her. It was a game, and they thought they'd claimed checkmate. They had no inkling they'd underestimated their quarry. Sandra tried to brush it off, sipping her wine as the first course arrived. Roasted quail on a bed of peppery arugula, its aroma rich with thyme. But the air had thickened, heavy with unspoken judgment. The room's power players avoided her now, offering tight-lipped smiles or pretending she'd melted into the damask walls. At Keanu's event, no less, where she'd expected kinship, not this shallow ostracism. She'd known him for years, shared quiet dinners in dimly lit bistros, traded stories under starlit skies about life's deeper currents. He prized substance over sheen, loathed the posturing that ruled this crowd. So why was she adrift in this sea of disdain? The main course landed. Filet mignon, its surface seared to a perfect crust, drizzled with a red wine reduction that glistened under the chandelier's glow. A waiter approached, his movements discreet, and slipped a folded note beside her plate. Sandra paused, her fork hovering over the tender meat, then unfolded the paper with a careful hand. The handwriting looped with aristocratic flair. "Sandra, darling, I hope you're enjoying yourself. If you need a proper dress for next year's event, I know some fabulous stylists. Kisses, Genevieve." Her breath hitched, a cold thread winding through her veins. This wasn't a barb. It was a bayonet, thrust to shred her dignity before the room. She crumpled the note slightly, her grip tightening as she raised her eyes. Across the ballroom, Genevieve and Charlotte watched, their faces alight with malicious glee. Lips curved into smug crescents, eyes glinting like cats savoring a cornered mouse. Sandra's pulse quickened, but she schooled her features into calm, her jaw set. She wouldn't let them see her fracture. Not now, not ever. But this wasn't just about petty social games anymore. Something bigger was happening, and she needed to figure out exactly what it was. She wasn't leaving, but she needed a moment away. Murmuring an excuse to no one in particular, she rose and slipped onto the garden terrace, the night air a sharp contrast to the ballroom's stifling heat. The space was a haven of shadowed roses, their petals velvet soft against the darkness, and ivy-draped columns that rustled faintly in the breeze. She'd carried her champagne out, and now she took a slow sip, the bubbles sharp against her tongue as she closed her eyes. The distant hum of the Gala faded, replaced by the whisper of leaves and the faint chirp of crickets beyond the stone balustrade. Why was this happening? Keanu had personally asked her here, knew she shunned ostentation, valued her for her steady heart. So why did she feel like an unwelcome guest in his world? Her respite was brief. Voices drifted from the garden's side entrance, low, conspiratorial, familiar. She froze, stepping behind an ivy-clad pillar, her breath shallow as her pulse ticked upward. Genevieve and Charlotte stood just beyond the terrace doors, their silhouettes framed against the golden spill of light from within. They stood just beyond the terrace doors, speaking in hushed, excited tones. Sandra had no interest in eavesdropping until she caught a name that made her breath hitch. Keanu Reeves. Sandra's heart sped up. What does Keanu have to do with them? Charlotte let out a soft, delighted laugh, her tone filled with secrecy. "Oh, he has a special surprise planned for tonight. I think Sandra will love it." Genevieve smirked. Or maybe not. A chill ran down Sandra's spine. Their tone was far from friendly. Her mind raced. What were they talking about? Keanu wasn't one for petty drama, so whatever they were planning had to be something carefully orchestrated. For the first time that night, Sandra felt a deep unease. What did Keanu have to do with this? And, more importantly, what were they planning? Sandra returned to the ballroom without rushing. She already knew exactly what kind of people she was dealing with. Genevieve and Charlotte were nothing new. Women who thrived on status, who lived under the illusion that exclusivity meant exclusion. That power was defined by who they could diminish, rather than who they could uplift. It was pathetic. And the funniest part? They actually believed she cared. She plucked a fresh glass of wine from a passing tray, the liquid ruby dark as it brushed her lips, and scanned the room with a steady gaze. The facade was impeccable. Glittering smiles, the clatter of silver on china, the rustle of silk gowns. But beneath it, the currents had shifted. Guests who'd once offered tepid hellos now studied their plates with rapt fascination, while others risked quick glances, reassessing her worth in whispers that fluttered like moths. Suddenly, their meals were incredibly interesting. Others risked quick, calculated glances, subtle once-overs, as if reassessing her worth in real time. Sandra almost laughed. It was absurd. As if a simple dress and the lack of diamonds somehow rendered her invisible. Poor souls. If only they knew how little she cared about their opinions. She savored a canapé, crisp pastry cradling a dollop of herbed cream, ignoring the silence that cloaked her table like a shroud. Across the room, Charlotte's eyes locked onto hers, a smirk tugging at her lips as she leaned toward Genevieve, whispering with theatrical flair. Sandra met her stare and smiled, a slow, genuine curve of her mouth, raising her glass in a silent toast. Charlotte faltered, her assurance flickering like a candle in a draught. She'd braced for shame, not this quiet defiance. Sandra rolled her eyes internally. The entire thing felt like something out of a bad high school movie. Two grown women, wealthy beyond measure, behaving like teenagers, playing a game of social exclusion as if it meant anything at all. It was laughable. A familiar figure caught her eye. Michael Whitmore, his silver hair catching the light, his warm eyes crinkling as he chatted near the bar. Zrania, a well-known actor and philanthropist, one of the few people in the room who actually seemed to care about more than just status. She considered going over to him, exchanging pleasantries, maybe even finding an ally in all this ridiculousness. But then, something made her stop. Michael was talking to Charlotte, and he was listening. Charlotte leaned in, her expression controlled, voice soft but deliberate. She was planting a seed, weaving one of her well-practiced manipulations. Michael nodded, seeming convinced. Sandra didn't feel angry, but she did feel disappointed. Michael was smart. He should have known better. He should have known women like Charlotte lived for moments like these, spinning half-truths, controlling the narrative. If he was listening, considering her words, then maybe he wasn't as trustworthy as she had once believed. A shame, but not a surprise. Sandra turned back toward her table, absent-mindedly playing with her fork, aware of the hushed whispers, the discreet glances in her direction. It didn't bother her. In fact, it was entertaining. These people took themselves so seriously, as if this ballroom, this perfectly curated performance of wealth and status, was the center of the universe. As if a dress choice was an unforgivable offense. Ridiculous. She took another bite of her meal, half wondering how much longer she'd have to sit through this charade before the real entertainment of the night began. A woman from the next table, shifting uncomfortably in her seat, finally spoke up. "Sandra, can I ask you something?" Sandra lifted her eyes. "Of course." The woman hesitated. "I heard some people saying that maybe you're only here because of Keanu." Sandra let out a small laugh. "Genevieve and Charlotte, right?" The woman nodded, her cheeks blooming pink. Sandra rested her elbow on the table, her gaze unwavering. "Tell me, do you really believe Keanu Reeves needs to invite someone just out of pity?" I'm not sure," the woman stammered. Sandra smirked. "Sure you do, but it's easier to pretend you don't," the woman flushed, quickly looking away. Sandra took another slow, deliberate sip of her wine. The silence at the table was delicious. She didn't owe anyone an explanation. Dinner was winding down. Keanu Reeves would soon take the stage for the big announcement of the night. Sandra knew he had no idea what had been happening behind the scenes. But she also knew one thing. The moment Keanu took the microphone, everything would change. Because Keanu didn't play these ridiculous social games. Genevieve and Charlotte thought they had power, but Keanu had respect, and that was something they could never buy. Sandra glanced toward the stage. The fun was just beginning. The room's attention shifting to the stage, a sleek platform framed by velvet curtains, the color of midnight. A host in a tailored tuxedo stepped to the microphone, his voice smooth as polished oak. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for being here tonight. Before we close, we have the honor of inviting the man who made this event possible. Please welcome Keanu Reeves. Applause roared, a wave crashing against the marble walls as Sandra set her glass down, crossing her arms. Genevieve and Charlotte leaned forward, their gazes fixed on the stage, expectant as if awaiting their own coronation. Sandra crossed her arms, taking her final sip of wine. Finally. The moment had arrived. Sandra, on the other hand, was simply curious. After all, what exactly was this surprise Keanu had planned? Keanu walked onto the stage with his usual relaxed demeanor, effortlessly commanding the room's attention. He took the microphone, pausing for a beat. "Thank you," he began, his voice a warm gravel that hushed the room. Then, he began. "First of all, I want to thank everyone for being here tonight. This cause means a lot to me, and seeing so many people come together to support it is truly incredible." The audience applauded again. Keanu continued, his voice steady yet warm, radiating the effortless charisma that had captivated audiences for decades. What many of you may not know is that Sandra has been one of the biggest donors and supporters of this cause. She has contributed financially and has also been actively involved in ensuring these projects reach further than we ever imagined. The ballroom held its breath for a heartbeat before applause erupted, echoing off the crystal chandeliers and mingling with the quartet's fading notes. Sandra sat still, her face a mask of composure, though inside, amusement danced like firelight. She stole a glance at Genevieve and Charlotte, their jaws slack, eyes wide with stunned disbelief. It was the exact opposite of what they had anticipated. For hours, they had painted Sandra as an outsider, an unworthy intruder in their world of exclusivity. They had orchestrated her dismissal, ensuring her social exile in the room. And now? Keanu had placed her at the very center of recognition. Genevieve tried to mask her discomfort, shoulders stiff, posture too perfect, but the flicker of unease in her eyes gave her away. Charlotte, however, was furious. Her hand tightened around her wine glass, knuckles turning white, her carefully maintained facade on the verge of cracking. Sandra observed them, savoring every second. The two women sat rigidly, not knowing how to react. This was not how the night was supposed to unfold. They had expected Keanu to praise them, or at the very least, make a generic statement about the prestigious nature of the attendees. Maybe they had even hoped for some backhanded remark that subtly reinforced their importance. But instead, the universe had a perfect sense of humor. Keanu paused for a beat, letting the weight of his words settle over the room before turning toward Sandra. "Sandra, if you would, I'd love for you to come up here." Another round of applause rippled through the room. Sandra exhaled subtly, a small smile playing on her lips. For a brief moment, she considered declining, letting her silent victory be enough. But then, she caught sight of Genevieve and Charlotte's faces, the mix of shock, frustration, and barely concealed resentment. Irresistible. Placing her glass on the table with careful precision, Sandra rose gracefully. The room watched as she moved toward the stage. She didn't rush. She didn't hesitate. She walked with poise, with confidence, with the quiet self-assurance of someone who knew exactly who she was and exactly how much power she held in this moment. Each step felt like a quiet victory. She reached the stage and stood beside Keanu, who smiled warmly as he handed her the microphone. "Thank you, Keanu." Sandra scanned the audience. She hadn't prepared a speech, but she didn't need one. "I find it amusing," she began, her voice steady, carrying across the grand ballroom, "how people assume that doing good things means seeking recognition." A murmur spread through the crowd. "I've never cared about being in the spotlight because, to me, helping is something you do, not something you showcase." The weight of her words landed exactly where she intended them to. Sandra continued, "And tonight, being here and receiving this recognition is unexpected, but meaningful, because it reminds me that, in the end, what truly matters isn't how we look, but the impact we leave in the world." A few guests shifted uncomfortably, suddenly unable to meet her gaze. She didn't need to call out names. They knew. Across the room, Genevieve and Charlotte sat completely still. Sandra could feel their presence, the rigidity of their posture, the silent rage simmering beneath their perfectly polished exteriors. The weight of her words had landed directly onto them, and there was nothing they could do but sit there and endure it. The audience burst into applause. Sandra allowed herself a small, knowing smile. She handed the microphone back to Keanu and walked off the stage at her own pace. Not in a hurry, not needing to bask in the attention. As she passed Genevieve and Charlotte's table, she slowed, just for a second. She looked at both women, tilted her head slightly, and in a smooth, quiet tone, said, "I hope you enjoy dinner." Then she walked away. Neither of them said a word. Charlotte clutched her wine glass so tightly, it looked like it might shatter. Genevieve forced a tight-lipped smile, but she was clearly defeated. Sandra returned to her seat, picked up the glass she had left behind, and took a slow sip. She crossed her legs and smiled to herself. The night had finally been worth it. As the applause continued, the event began moving toward its conclusion. But Sandra wasn't done noticing things. Out of the corner of her eye, she caught something. Charlotte leaned toward Genevieve, whispering something urgently. Sandra couldn't hear the words, but she saw it. The shift in Genevieve's expression, the momentary flicker of uncertainty, the slight tension in her posture. Something wasn't right. After everything, what else could they possibly be plotting? Sandra glanced around the ballroom, watching as guests carefully recalibrated their social strategies in real time. Conversations shifted, alliances subtly reformed. Those who had once dismissed her now lingered nearby, hoping to catch her eye, eager to align themselves with someone who had just been publicly recognized by Keanu Reeves. It was almost comical. The same people who had barely acknowledged her existence mere hours ago were now smiling wider, leaning in closer, searching for an opportunity to rebuild a connection they had never even bothered to establish before. Sandra wasn't naive. She knew exactly what was happening. They hadn't changed. They had simply realized they were wrong, and they didn't want to be on the losing side. That didn't bother her, but it didn't impress her either. She turned her attention back to Genevieve and Charlotte, who remained seated, their earlier confidence completely drained. Charlotte still held her wine glass, but she was no longer smiling. Genevieve, always composed, always poised, tried to maintain an air of indifference, but Sandra could see the subtle tension in her jaw, the way her fingers lightly drummed against the stem of her glass. They had lost everything they had spent the night trying to build. The whispers, the exclusion, the carefully calculated looks. All of it had crumbled in a matter of minutes. And the worst part? They had done it to themselves. The truth was simple. They had tried to weaponize appearances as power, believing that status was something they controlled. But in the end, appearances meant nothing when the truth came out. Sandra had no interest in wasting any more time on them. But as she passed their table, she caught something. A whisper, barely audible but unmistakable. She can pretend she doesn't care, but deep down, she just wants acceptance, like everyone else. Sandra stopped. Slowly, she turned. Then, with calm deliberation, she pulled out a chair and sat down beside them. Crossing her legs, she picked up her wine glass, taking a slow, measured sip before responding. "Genevieve," she said smoothly, setting her glass down. "If I wanted acceptance from people like you, I would have shown up covered in diamonds, just to be worthy of this room. Don't you think?" Genevieve's face stiffened. Charlotte looked away. Sandra let a small smile play at her lips before continuing. "The truth is, you spent the entire night trying to bring me down because you believe status is measured by what you wear, who you socialize with, and how many people envy you. But if tonight proved anything, it's that what really matters." She leaned in slightly, lowering her voice just enough. "It can't be bought." Genevieve forced a thin smile, her voice clipped. "You're overreacting. This event has always been for people of our world." Sandra tilted her head slightly, her eyes gleaming with amusement. "And you really think you're at the top, don't you?" she mused. Then she glanced around the room, taking in the shifting dynamics, the subtle but undeniable change in the way people now regarded her versus them. "Tell me, Genevieve, who do you think people actually respect right now?" She met the woman's gaze. "Because from what I see, it's not you." Genevieve's grip tightened on her glass. "The funniest part? You did this to yourselves." She let the silence hang between them, letting the weight of that truth settle. "If you had treated me like any other guest tonight, you could have avoided this entire embarrassment." Silence. Charlotte seemed ready to say something, but she knew there was nothing left to say. Sandra simply smiled, utterly unbothered. "Good luck fixing this." She stood up without haste, leaving them exactly as they were, stunned and defeated. Genevieve and Charlotte stayed silent. This time, they knew they had lost. Sandra walked toward Keanu, who had been watching from a distance. He lifted his glass toward her, smirking. "Well played." Sandra smiled, clinking her glass lightly against his. "If they think they can take me down with gossip, they're seriously underestimating my patience." Keanu chuckled. "You know what I find funny?" he mused, glancing around. "How people cling so tightly to this idea of status, as if it actually means something in the grand scheme of things." Sandra nodded, her gaze sweeping over the ballroom. "I saw so many people change their attitude after your speech, as if a public tribute from someone important suddenly determined my worth." Keanu exhaled, shaking his head slightly. "People need external validation to decide who deserves respect. But real respect? It doesn't need validation." Sandra turned to him. "And that's why you've never played this game. You never cared about this whole performance?" Keanu shrugged. "Maybe some will, but most will go on believing that status and wealth are all that matter." Sandra followed his gaze toward Genevieve and Charlotte. Neither of them was smiling anymore. The smug satisfaction they had carried all evening had vanished, replaced by a quiet, uneasy realization that the world they had built for themselves, the illusion of control, of social dominance, had fractured beyond repair. And yet others would remember this night forever. Keanu nodded. Yeah, some will. Without another word, he and Sandra turned and walked out of the ballroom together. The cool night air was a stark contrast to the stifling atmosphere they had left behind. The black car waited at the curb, its sleek frame gleaming under the golden glow of the entrance lights. The muffled hum of the event still lingered behind them, but it felt distant now, as though the entire night had been nothing more than a scripted performance, one whose ending had been rewritten at the last moment. Sandra paused before getting in. She took one last glance back at the venue, at the grandeur that had masked so many false appearances, at the people still inside, desperately trying to reshape the narrative of the night. What had begun as an evening fueled by pretense and exclusion had ended with undeniable truths. She turned back to Keanu and smiled. I think we learned something tonight. Keanu raised an eyebrow, his signature smirk playing at the corner of his lips. And what's that? Sandra opened the car door but hesitated, meeting his gaze one final time. It doesn't matter what you wear, who you associate with, or what people think of you. She smiled, her voice steady and certain. The only thing that truly matters is who you are when no one is watching. Keanu held her gaze, his expression softening before a quiet chuckle escaped him. And you've always known that. Sandra stepped into the car, closing the door behind her. Keanu stood there for a moment, watching as the vehicle slipped into the night, carrying Sandra away from an evening that had changed everything, for her, for them, and for those who had tried to define her by the wrong things. The story of Sandra Bullock's night at the Gala is more than just an account of social status and redemption. It's a reflection of real life. How often do we judge others based on appearance, wealth, or social standing, only to realize later that true worth is something deeper? In a world obsessed with status and perception, this story reminds us that character outweighs image, and respect cannot be bought. It must be earned. Sandra didn't need to prove herself to anyone that night. She didn't seek validation from those who tried to diminish her. Instead, she let the truth speak for itself, showing that the real measure of a person is who they are when no one is watching. This lesson applies to all of us. Whether in our workplaces, friendships, or daily interactions, we should ask ourselves, do we judge too quickly? Do we let appearances cloud our understanding of someone's true value? What would you have done if you were in Sandra's position? Let us know in the comments. And if you love stories that challenge perspectives and inspire change, subscribe to our channel for more powerful narratives. Don't forget to hit the like button and turn on notifications so you never miss a story that matters.